Merry Christmas, everybody. Is this on? Christmas
Yeah.
Eve? I don't know.
Test, test. We're talking into the microphone.
Gotcha.
They can't hear us unless we talk into the microphone. Sorry, did I hurt you? Well, then why'd you say
Oh, I
ouch?
hit my knee.
Hey, everybody. Merry Christmas Eve.
Merry Christmas Eve.
We've got Mitch and Samantha and Robin, which probably means that Chris is somewhere too.
Hey, guys.
Samantha, hello from California. Clyde, hey, how you doing? It is
Just down the road.
it is very pleasant here in Florida right
It
now.
is. It was cold earlier. I thought you were gonna be all buttoned up in a parka jacket.
I am wearing a hoodie and I do have my Santa hat on, which has actually got Mickey Mouse ears on it. Yeah. We'll wait a few minutes for people to kind of file in and get ready to hang out with us and that kind of thing. And then we'll start reading you some scary stories, or maybe not so scary, but they've got some ghost kind of appeal to
Yeah.
them.
What's everybody doing? Wisconsin's way too warm for Christmas.
Wow, who would have thought Wisconsin would be warm? Hey, Faith, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Chris. Robin said she's there too.
Okay. Hopefully, she's not on call.
Oh, yeah.
20 centimeters of snow here today. Oh, Canada. Oh,
Canada.
Canada.
We're terrible.
Okay, so Kelly,
Yes.
what is 20 centimeters of snow equal out to?
Oh, crap. Really?
Hey, Sherry, how are you?
I don't know.
Can everybody hear us okay? I'm assuming they can. Watching Christmas movies with the family. Oh, that's nice.
Nice.
Very nice.
Which ones?
Looks like we have somebody watching us over on YouTube too. So,
Can't
hello.
see that far over.
Hey, Jenny. We've got Tom. They're getting snow there in Colorado. Where are you at in Colorado, Tom? Hello from Arkansas, or as they like to say, Arkansas. We have our fire going.
Well, kind of.
Actually, I've got to do it this way, right? Wow.
No, because you have it front facing.
There we go.
Lovely. That's great. There
Oh.
goes the neighbor's car alarm. We
The
have a party
neighbors are
going on.
the neighbors are like outside having some fun. So you might hear some voices in the background. And right across from us is a very nice port. Oh, somebody
Family.
fired up the thing. Puerto Rican family, and they can be kind of loud sometimes.
Well, they have good parties.
They do have good
All
parties.
their family joins in, but they're very respectful, and they shut it down early. So
Sherry's wrapping presents, and it's 54 degrees in Bowling Green.
just grilled a T-bone. Clyde, come on over. Bring it here.
Hey, sure. Well, we already had dinner though.
I know. I'm full.
We're gonna have hamburgers for Christmas tomorrow. Woohoo!
She makes the best hamburger.
Hey, Michelle. She's in Kentucky. So we've got two people in here from Kentucky. And Tom's in Montrose, about to head back east to Pueblo. Well, if you're going to be driving, be careful.
Yeah.
Samantha has a fire too, but the snow they expected got pushed back to Thursday. Well, that kind of stinks. Hey, did you see the Kelly got me these glasses for Christmas? Aren't they cool? If people are interested, we might try to figure out a way we can get some made for everybody. All right, Kelly, what are you drinking first?
Oh, I'm drinking dragon's milk.
Dragon's milk. Did you actually have to go up to the dragon and milk it?
Oh my god. That's taking me back to the last Jedi movie last night where you had no idea where the green milk came from.
Oh, yeah, because we want to go see the new Star Wars movie, and I hadn't seen The Last Jedi yet. And I had no idea where blue milk and green milk came from, but I found
What
out.
they serve at Galaxy's Edge.
Hey, Suzanne. So we four of us from Florida here right now. Because we got Suzanne,
Yeah.
Clyde, you and me. And every so often we have somebody pop in over at YouTube and then they disappear. But, you know,
I can't see that far.
great. Okay, so this is our tradition that we have done every year for the last, I
Okay.
believe, 5 Christmas Eves, is we are keeping that tradition that the Victorians started of telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve, which is why, I mean, one of the reasons why Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. And if you guys have not seen FX's version of the Christmas Carol that came out this year,
You gotta see it. Oh my
oh, it
gosh,
is
it was
so
so
good
good.
and creepy. Hey, Cynthia, Tanya, Alyssa. I hope I said that right. All right. So we have this great little book here that is actually classic tales for Halloween. But hey, Christmas Eve is like Halloween to us. But what I thought was really cool is even though it's tales for Halloween, the foreword talks about telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve. And it says, these are some of the very best from a rich tradition of terrifying tales that dates back to Christmas Eve, 1764. It was then that the first ever horror novel was published, The Castle of Otranto. I think is how you say that. Otranto, do you think?
I think so.
By Horace Walpole. This was an eerie tale of ghosts, family curses, and macabre goings ons. Goings on? Set in a foreign land during medieval times, an era when everyone believed in the supernatural and lived in fear of many superstitions. The Castle of Otranto captivated the imagination of 18th century readers and began a public craze for many more. Through the Victorian era, which lasted from 1837 to 1901, families and friends loved nothing better than to gather round the parlor fire on dark evenings to listen to a sinister and spooky story. And obviously, we know they were into spiritualism, so maybe they had a seance or two while they were telling their ghost
Could
stories
be.
too. We've got Lisa with us, Deborah. I think we got that.
And Tanya Hines.
Robin just watched the Muppets Christmas Carol. That one's pretty good too.
Oh yeah.
All right, so I'm going to read the first story.
Okay.
One of my favorite ghost story authors from back in the day is M.R. James. Oh, he is so good. I love him. This is a story that he wrote in 1924. There was a man dwelt by a churchyard. And speaking of churchyard, this Friday I am going to be, I guess, being taped with Hillbilly Horror Stories, and I'm going to be talking about Greyfriars Kirkyard, which is basically a churchyard, and I'm going to be talking about a poltergeist that's in that cemetery. So hopefully that'll be out like next week or something like that. Anyway, here we go. This, you know, is the beginning of the story about sprites and goblins, which Mamilius, the child in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, was telling to his mother, the queen, and the court ladies when the king came in with guards and hurried her off to prison. There is no more of the story. Mamilius died soon after without having a chance of finishing it. Now, what was it going to have been? Shakespeare knew, no doubt, and I will be bold to say that I do. It was not going to be a new story. It was to be one which you have most likely heard and even told. Everybody may set it in what frame he likes best. This is mine. There was a man dwelt by a churchyard. His house had a lower story of stone and an upper one of timber. The front windows looked out on the street, and the back ones on the churchyard. It had once belonged to the parish priest, but this was in the days of Queen Elizabeth I. The priest was a married man and wanted more room. Yeah, a priest married man.
Okay.
Besides, his wife disliked seeing the churchyard at night out of her bedroom window, which, what is wrong with
I
her?
know. Come
I would love that. She said she saw, but never mind what she said, anyhow. She gave her husband no peace till he agreed to move into a larger house in the village street, and the old one was taken by John Poole, who was a widower and lived there alone. He was an elderly man who kept very much to himself and by torchlight. Ooh. And it was noticed that whenever a funeral was toward, John Poole was at his window, either on the ground floor or upstairs, according as he could get the better view from one or the other.
He's great.
So it
he's
sounds like he was running up and down the stairs to see which way he saw could see the best. Hey, Wes. Sasha. Hey, Dina. Dina's hanging out in a cabin and had a really cool experience today. She got to take pictures of a couple who had just gotten married and they were like
Aw.
21 or something.
Oh,
So
nice.
thought that was kind of cool. Okay, where was I? There came a night when an old woman was to be buried. She was fairly well to she was not liked in the place. The usual thing was said of her that she was no Christian, and that on such nights as Midsummer Eve and All Hallows, she was not to be found in her house. She was red eyed and dreadful to look at, and no beggar ever knocked at her door. Yet when she died, she left a purse of money to the church. There was no storm on the night of her burial. It was fair and calm, but there was some difficulty about getting bearers and men to carry the torches, in spite of the fact that she had left larger fees than common for such as did that work. So she left a bunch of money and they didn't want to do it.
That's so sad.
She was buried in woolen without a coffin. No one was there but those who were actually needed, and John Poole watched from his window. Just before the grave was filled in, the parson stooped down and cast something upon the body, something that clinked, and in a low voice he said words that sounded like, "Thy money perish with thee." Man. Then he walked quickly away, and so did the other men, leaving only one torchbearer to light the sexton and his boy while they shoveled the earth in. They made no very neat job of it, and next day, which was a Sunday, the churchgoers were rather sharp with the sexton, saying it was the untidiest grave in the yard. And indeed, when he came to look at it himself, he thought it was worse than he had left it. Oh, that's not good. If
Not shocking since he threw some change in there. Some
no, that
money.
was the other guy.
But that was the clink that I'm saying that.
Well, here's the problem. The last person to be at the grave was the sexton. And he comes back and goes,
Yeah.
"That's not how we left it."
Well, I know, but they.
Hey, Whitney and Stephanie, Janae. I think we're getting everybody here. Okay. Meanwhile, John Poole went about with a curious air, half exulting as it were, and half nervous. More than once he spent an evening at the inn, which was clean, contrary to his usual habit, and to those who fell into talk with him, there he hinted that he had come into a little bit of money and was looking out for a somewhat better house. What?
Wonder where that came from.
You think?
Think.
Well, I don't wonder, said the smith one night. I shouldn't care for that place. I should be fancying things all night. The landlord asked him what sort of things. Well, maybe somebody climbing up to the chamber window or the like of that, said the smith. I don't know. Old Mother Wilkins that was buried a week ago today, eh? So apparently he thinks people are crawling out of their graves. Come, I think you might consider of a person's feelings, said the landlord. It ain't so pleasant for Master Poole, is it now? Master Poole don't mind, said the smith. He's been there long enough to know. I only says it wouldn't be my choice. What with the passing bell and the torches when there's a burial and all them graves laying so quiet when there's no one about. Only they say there's lights. Don't you never see no lights, Poole? No, I don't never see no light, said Master Poole sulkily, and called for another drink and went home late. That night, as he lay in his bed upstairs, a moaning wind began to play about the house, and he could not go to sleep. Hey, Caitlin. Oh, where was I? Okay. He got up and crossed the room to a little cupboard in the wall. He took out of it something that clinked and put it in the breast of his bedgown. Then he went to the window and looked out into the churchyard. Have you ever seen an old brass in a church with a figure of a person in a shroud? It is bunched together at the top of the head in a curious way. Something like that was sticking up out of the earth in a spot of the churchyard, which John Poole knew very well. He darted into his bed and lay there, very still indeed. Presently, something made a very faint rattling at the casement. With a dreadful reluctance, John Poole turned his eyes that way. Alas, between him and the moonlight was the black outline of the curious bunched head. Then there was a figure in the room. Dry earth rattled on the floor. A low, cracked voice said, "Where is it?" And steps went hither and thither, faltering steps as of someone walking with difficulty. It could be seen now and again, peering into corners, stooping to look under chairs. Finally, it could be heard fumbling at the doors of the cupboard in the wall, throwing them open. There was a scratching of long nails on the empty shelves. The figure whipped round, stood for an instant at the side of the bed, raised its arms, and with a hoarse scream of, "You've got it!" At this point, HRH Prince Mamilius, who would, I think, have made the story a good deal shorter than this, flung himself with a loud yell upon the youngest of the court ladies present, who responded with an equally piercing cry. He was instantly seized upon by HM Queen Hermione, who, repressing an inclination to laugh, shook and slapped him very severely. Much flushed and rather inclined to cry, he was about to be sent to bed. But on the intercession of his victim, who had now recovered from the shock, he was eventually permitted to remain until his usual hour for retiring, by which time he too had so far recovered as to assert, in bidding goodnight to the company, that he knew another story quite 3 times as dreadful as that one, and would tell it on the first opportunity that offered. How good was that?
That was cute.
He scared himself telling the
Yeah,
story.
exactly.
All right, well, this is another great author, Ambrose Bierce. And Kelly is going to share this one, A Bottomless Grave from 1888. Hey, Rosamond, we've got Mike in here. I think that's everybody. Merry Christmas Eve, and hey to those people over there on YouTube. We got a couple of them over there, too. I'll go type a message to them.
All right, and I do tend to do voices, and I'm not trying to do like really poor accents. I have to differentiate who's whom when I'm reading it, and I'll probably screw it up, but bear with me, guys. I don't mean any disrespect. So I'm going to read A Bottomless Grave by Ambrose Bierce. My name is John Brenwalter. My father, a drunkard, had a patent for an invention for making coffee berries out of clay, but he was an honest man and would not himself engage in the manufacture. He was, therefore, only moderately wealthy, his royalties from his really valuable invention bringing him hardly enough to pay for his expenses of litigation with rogues guilty of infringement. So I lacked many advantages enjoyed by the children of unscrupulous and dishonorable parents. And had it not been for a noble and devoted mother who neglected all my brothers and sisters and personally supervised my education, should have grown up in ignorance and been compelled to teach school. I think that that's a noble job to do, but apparently he doesn't think so. Okay. To be the favorite child of a good woman is better than gold. When I was 19 years of age, my father had the misfortune to die. He had always had perfect health, and his death, which occurred at the dinner table without a moment's warning,
Oh my God.
surprised no one more than himself.
How would you know that it surprised your dad? He just killed over.
Okay. He had that very morning been notified that a patent had been granted him for a device to burst open safes by hydraulic pressure without noise. The commissioner of patents had pronounced it at the most ingenious, effective, and generally. Oof, we've got stuff flying off of the torch over there. Yes. All right. The Commissioner of Patents had pronounced it the most ingenious, effective, and generally meritorious invention that had ever been submitted to him, and my father had naturally looked forward to an old age of prosperity and honor. His sudden death was, therefore, a deep disappointment to him, I would imagine.
I'd be a little disappointed too.
But my mother, whose piety and resignation to the will of heaven were, were conspicuous virtues of her character, was apparently less affected.
Mom didn't care that Dad died.
At the close of the meal, when my poor father's body had been removed from the floor, she called us all into an adjoining room and addressed us as follows. My children, the uncommon occurrence that you have just witnessed is one of the most disagreeable incidents in a good man's life, and one in which I take little pleasure, I assure you. I beg you to believe that I had no hand in bringing it about. Of course, she added, after a pause during which her eyes were cast down in deep thought. Of course, it is better that he is dead. She.
Wow. Jeez. Thanks, Mom. Dad's dead. Okay.
She uttered this with so evident a sense of its obviousness that a self evident truth that none of us had the courage to brave her surprise by asking an explanation. My mother's air of surprise when any of us went wrong in any way was very terrible to us. One day, when in a fit of peevish temper, I had taken the liberty to cut off the baby's ear.
What?
Her simple words, "John, you surprise me," appeared to me so sharp a reproof that after a sleepless night I went to her in tears and throwing myself at her feet exclaimed, "Mother, forgive me for surprising you." So now we all, including the one eared baby, felt that it would keep matters smoother to accept without question the statement that was better, somehow, for our dear father to be dead. My mother continued, "I must tell you, my children, that in a case of sudden and mysterious death, the law requires the coroner to come out and cut the body into pieces and submit them to a number of men who, having inspected them, pronounce the person dead.
Well,
For
if you cut him up into pieces, he's gonna be dead.
this is so funny. I mean, I'm sorry. For this, the coroner gets a large sum of money. I wish to avoid that painful formality in this instance. It is one which never had of the remains. John," here my mother turned her angel face to me, her angel face.
I wonder if his mom's an
"You,
angel.
you are an educated lad and very discreet. You now have an opportunity to show your gratitude for all the sacrifices that your education has entitled upon you from the rest of us. John, go and get rid of the coroner." Inexpressibly delighted by this proof of my mother's confidence, and by the chance to distinguish myself by an act that squared with my natural disposition, I knelt before her, carried her hand to my lips, and bathed it with tears of sensibility. Before 5 o'clock that afternoon, I had got rid of the coroner. I was immediately arrested and thrown into jail, where I passed a most uncomfortable night, being unable to sleep because of the profanity of my fellow prisoners. Two clergymen, whose theological training had given them a fertility of impious ideas and a command of blasphemous language, altogether unparalleled. This story cracks me up. But along towards morning, the jailer, who, sleeping in an adjoining room, had been equally disturbed, entered the cell and with fearful oath warned the reverend gentleman that if he heard any more swearing, their sacred calling would not prevent him from turning them into the street. After that, they moderated their objectionable conversation, substituting an accordion, and I slept the peaceful and refreshing sleep of youth and innocence. He just committed, or he just admitted to murdering his father, apparently, but he's sleeping well, even though he had nothing to do with it.
Mom was glad, so hey.
Good grief. The next morning, I was taken before the superior judge, sitting as a committing ma- The next morning, I was taken before the superior judge, sitting as a committing magistrate, and put upon my preliminary examination. I pleaded not guilty, adding that the man whom I had murdered was a notorious Democrat. My good mother was a Republican, and from early childhood, I had been carefully instructed by her in the principle of honest government and the necessity of suppressing factional opposition. The judge, elected by a Republican ballot box with a sliding bottom, was visibly impressed by the cognancy of my plea and offered me a cigarette. Okay. I think this story is far from spooky.
Here, have a cigarette, man.
Oh my word.
Can you imagine a judge? You need a smoke?
Back in the day, I guess. I don't know. May it please your. It is therefore your duty to commit. Testimony and argument alike, I would imply a doubt that your honor means to perform your sworn duty. That is my case. My counsel, a brother of the deceased coroner, rose and said, "May it please the court, my learned friend on the other side has so well and eloquently stated the law governing in this case that it only remains for me to inquire to what extent it has already been complied with. It is true, your honor is a committing magistrate, and as such it is your duty to commit. What? That matter is which the law has wisely justly left in your own discretion, and wisely you have discharged already every obligation that the law imposes. Since I have known your honor, you have done nothing but commit. You have committed embracery, theft, arson, perjury, adultery, murder, every crime in the calendar, and every excess known to the sensual and depraved, including my learned friend, the district attorney. You have done your whole duty as committing magistrate, and there is no evidence against this worthy my client. Oh, wait. And there is no evidence against this worthy young man, my client. I move that he be discharged. An impressive. I can't speak anymore.
You're good.
Sorry, guys. Blah, blah, blah. An impressive silence ensued. The judge arose and, in a voice trembling with emotion, sentenced me to life and liberty. Then, turning to my counsel, he said coldly but significantly, I will see you later.
Sentenced to life and liberty.
I guess.
I didn't know you could
he's-
sentence somebody to that.
And apparently
Hey,
he was
Pam,
released.
Laura, Melissa, and Kevin. Thanks for joining us.
The next morning, the
Merry
lawyer.
Christmas Eve.
Merry Christmas Eve. The next morning, the lawyer who had defended me against a charge of murdering his own brother, with whom he had a quarrel about some land, had disappeared, and his fate to this day is unknown.
So his lawyer just disappeared that night.
Suspiciously. In the meantime, my poor father's body had been secretly buried at midnight in the backyard of his late residence, with his late boots on and the contents of his late stomach unanalyzed. He was opposed to display, said my dear mother, as she finished tamping down the earth above him and assisted the children to litter the place with straw. His instincts were all domestic, and he loved a quiet life.
So mom buried him, too.
With all the kids assisting.
Great. Here, kids, throw some hay on Dad's grave.
Well, yeah. My mother's application for letters of administration stated that she had good reason to believe that the deceased was dead. Okay. For he had not come home to his meals for several days.
Oh.
But the judge of the Crowbait Court, as ever contemptuously it was called, decided that the proof of death was insufficient and put the estate into the hands of the public administrator, who was his son-in-law.
There's nothing weird going on there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It was found that the liabilities were exactly balanced by the assets. There was left only the patent for the device for bursting open safes without noise by hydraulic pressure, and this had passed into the ownership of the probate judge and the public administrator. As my dear mother preferred to spell it. Thus, within a few brief months, a worthy and respectable family was reduced from prosperity to crime. Necessity compelled us to go to work. In the selection of occupations, we were governed by a variety of considerations, such as personal fitness, inclination, and so forth. My mother opened a select private school for instruction in the art of changing the spots upon leopard skin rugs. My eldest...
What? Wait a minute. She started like a school to teach people how to take leopard spots off of a rug?
It's a bunch of garbage. She was shamming.
Oh. But who would think that that was a legit business?
Just listen.
Okay.
My eldest brother, George Henry, who had a turn for music, became a bugler.
Suzanne likes your mother voice, by the way.
Oh, God. Thank you.
Hey, Matthew.
Became a bugler in the neighboring asylum for youths.
Okay.
My sister, Mary Maria, took orders for Professor Pumpernickel's Essence of Lackeys for flavoring mineral springs. And I set up as an adjuster and gilder of crossbeams for gibbets. The other children, too young for labor, continued to steal small articles in front of shops as they had been taught.
Great. This is a wonderful family.
In our intervals of leisure, we decoyed travelers into our house and buried the bodies in the cellar.
Oh my God. Jeez.
And I'm just sitting here laughing through the whole story.
Yeah, that worries me the way you just keep cackling and giggling, Kelly.
I just think
If you
it's
guys
so
don't see me
ridiculous.
tomorrow,
Oh,
check
stop
the
it.
backyard.
We don't have a cellar, so you're safe.
No, that's
For now.
good. For now. Better not visit any houses that have them.
Just wait till I get a sod cutter.
Oh, Lord.
We need to get all that grass out. All right. That smoke is bugging me. All right. In one part of the cellar, we kept wines, liquors, provisions. From the rapidity of their disappearance, we acquired superstitious belief that the persons buried there came at dead of night and held a festival.
So they're having a party.
I guess the people that they've killed and buried.
Oh, wonderful.
It was at least certain that frequently of a morning we would discover fragments of pickled meats, canned goods, and such debris littering the place, although it had been securely locked and barred against human intrusion. It was proposed to remove the provisions and store them elsewhere, but our dear mother, always generous and hospitable, said it was better to endure the loss than risk exposure. If the ghosts were denied this trifling gratification, they might set foot on an investigation, which would overthrow our scheme of the division of labor by diverting the energies of the whole family into single industry pursued by me. We might all decorate the cross beams of gibbets. We accepted her decision with filial submission due to our reverence to, for her worldly knowledge and wisdom, the purity of her character.
Yeah, that's a pure woman, all right. She's got, not only does she not care that her husband's dead and probably helped her son kill him,
Well, I think she poisoned him
well, she probably
because she
did.
was saying that she didn't want the contents of his stomach.
That's true. So not only did she off the husband, hey, Sam. Oh, is Morgan around? Um, but then she's like teaching her family to steal and they're killing people in their house.
What's in our drinks? You you have
I'm
Sam
drinking
Adams
Sam Adams
Oktoberfest, and I have Dragon's Milk. And we got some special glasses. But look,
We framed it.
Morgan's picture that she drew us. It's
So
so
now this will go
amazing.
up in the studio. Isn't that wonderful? Will it balance right here?
She's
Maybe not.
there. Hey, Morgan. Thank you so much for what you drew. We love it.
We love it. It's wonderful.
I framed it today, and we're all set to display it.
I don't think it'll stay right here. I don't want
Oh
it to
no,
slide
it's
around.
it's glass. I would move it because I don't want it to fall and break.
All right.
And I have to find my place. Sorry, guys. We went on a tangent. Kind of a rabbit hole, but not really.
You've joined me
Okay.
in the rabbit hole.
That's right.
We actually have one in the podcast episode coming out Thursday. Okay, so her purity of character, yes.
Right. My glasses are
We probably could blow out our skull because I don't think anybody can see it
I
anyway.
think the smoke is bothering my eyes. One night while we were you can't do it from there.
Do it like this.
Yeah, don't burn yourself.
And just like that, the
Good
smoke
job,
is gone.
babe. One night while we were all in the cellar, none dared to enter it alone, engaged in bestowing upon the mayor of the adjoining town the solemn office of Christian burial. My mother and the younger children, holding a candle each, while George Henry and I labored with a spade and pick, my sister Mary Maria uttered a shriek and covered her eyes with her hands. We were all dreadfully startled, and the mayor's funeral rites were instantly suspended in their cellar. Why?
They killed the mayor?
They killed everybody.
Jeez.
While with pale faces and trembling tones, we begged her to say what had alarmed her. The younger children were so agitated that they held their candles unsteadily, and the wavering of our figures were uncouth and grotesque movements on the walls, and flung themselves into the most uncanny attitudes. The face of the dead man, now gleaming ghastly in the light, now extinguished by some floating shadow, appeared each emergence to have taken on a new and more forbidding expression, a maligner menace. Oh, am I speaking into it wrong? Sorry. Frightened even more than ourselves by the girl's scream, rats raced in multitudes about the place, squeaking shrilly or stared the black opacity of substance corner with steadfast eyes, mere points of green light matching the faint phosphorescence of decay that filled the half dug grave, and seemed the visible manifestation of faint odor of mortality, which tainted the unwholesome air. Gross.
Means it stunk.
The children now sobbed and clung about the limbs
Poor
of their
kids.
elders. I know, good grief. Dropping their candles and were near being left in total darkness. Just wait. Except for that sinister light, which slowly welled upwards from the disturbed earth and overflowed the edges of the grave like a fountain. Meanwhile, my sister, crouching in the earth that had been thrown out from the excavation, had removed her hands from her face and was staring with expanded eyes into an obscure place between two wine casks. There it is! There it is! She shrieked, pointing. God in heaven, can't you see it? And there indeed it was, a human figure, dimly discernible in the gloom, a figure that wavered from side to side as if about to fall, clutching at the wine casks for support, had stepped unsteadily forwards and for one moment stood revealed in the light of our remaining candles. Then it surged heavily and fell prone upon the earth. In that moment, we had all recognized the figure, the face and bearing of our father, dead these 10 months and buried by our own hands. Our father, indubitably risen and ghastly drunk.
What? Hey, Mindy.
On the incidents of our on the incidents of our precipitate flight from that horrible place, on the extinction of all human sentiment in that tumultuous, mad scramble up the damp and moldy stairs, slipping, falling, pulling one another down, and clambering over one another's
I can
back,
see it now.
right? The lights extinguished, babes trampled beneath the feet of their strong brothers and hurled backwards to death by a mother's arm.
So she's just tossing the kids aside and running ahead of them.
She is all about herself.
Boy, she is something else. What a piece of work.
On all this, I do not dare to dwell. My mother, my eldest brother and sister, and I escaped. The others remained below, to perish to their wounds or their terror, some perhaps by flame. For within an hour, we four, hastily gathering together what money and jewels we had and what clothing we could carry, fired the dwelling and fled by its light into the hill.
They set the house on fire with some of the kids still inside.
Yes. Good
These
grief.
people are horrible.
I'm sorry that I'm laughing, but this
Hey,
is like
Amanda, Merry Christmas.
kind of ridiculous.
Well, this is the kind of person that Ambrose Bierce was. He had
A sixth sense of humor.
Yes.
We did not even pause to collect the insurance. God forbid. And my dear mother said on her deathbed, years afterwards in a distant land, that this was the only sin of omission that lay upon her conscience.
Are you kidding me? The only
Listen,
sin that she
keep
felt she had
listening.
was not collecting the insurance?
Her confessor, a holy man, assured her that under the circumstances, heaven would pardon the neglect.
Great. Heaven won't be upset that you didn't collect the insurance, of course, after you killed I don't know how many people and buried them down there.
About 10 years after our removal from the scenes of my childhood, I returned in disguise to the spot with a view to obtaining some treasure belonging to us, which had been buried in the cellar. I may say that unsuccessful.
Hey, Preston.
The discovery of many human bones in the ruins had set the authorities digging for more.
Oh.
Shocker. They had found the treasure and had kept it for their honesty. Well, at least somebody was. The house had not been rebuilt. The whole suburb was, in fact, a desolation. So many unearthly sights and sounds had been reported thereabout that nobody would live there. As there was none to question nor molest, I resolved to gratify my filial piety by gazing once more upon the face of my father. Really? You want to dig him up and gaze upon him? Keep listening. If indeed our eyes had deceived us and he was still in his grave, I remembered that he had always worn an enormous diamond ring.
Ah, we don't want to gaze
And
on
never
Dad's
having-
We want his ring.
And never having seen it nor heard of it since his death, I had reason to think he might have been buried in it.
I bet. I can't believe they would have neglected to take that off of his
There,
hand.
there's no way that they did, but whatever. Procuring a spade, I soon located the grave in what had been the backyard and began digging. When I had got down about 4 feet, the whole bottom fell out of the grave, and I was precipitated into a large drain, falling through a long hole in its crumbling arch. There was no body, nor any vestige of one.
Uh-oh.
Unable to get out of the excavation, I crept through the drain and, having with some difficulty removed a mass of charred rubbish and blackened masonry that choked it, emerged into what had been that fateful cellar. All was clear. My father, whatever had caused him to have taken bad at his meal, and I think it was possible that my sainted mother could have thrown some light upon that, had indubitably been buried alive.
Oh boy.
The grave having been accidentally dug above the forgotten drain and down almost to the crown of its arch, had no coffin, and having been wait, and no coffin having been used, his struggles on reviving had broken the long rotted masonry and he had fallen through, eventually escaping into the cellar. Feeling that he was no longer welcome in his own house,
I mean,
yet,
they only tried to kill you and bury you.
yet having no other, he had lived in subterranean seclusion, a witness to our thrift and a pensioner on our providence. It was he who had eaten our food, and it was he who had drunk our wine. He was no better than a common thief.
But it was in his own home.
Uh-huh. In a moment of intoxication and feeling no doubt that need of companionship, which was the one sympathetic link between a drunken man and his race, he had left his place of concealment in a strangely inopportune time, ent- entailing the most deplorable consequences upon those nearest and dearest to him. A blunder that had almost the dignity of crime. So it's his father's fault that the kids were like
See
thrown,
what you did to us, Dad? We had
left
all
down the
this
stairs.
trouble.
They burned the house.
We had to burn down the house, kill some of my brothers and sisters, go away to some distant land, all because of you, Dad. Because you didn't just die and let us bury you.
But the mother would be forgiven of her sins.
Yeah.
It's all good.
Her only sin is that she didn't pick up the insurance money.
Right.
All right, let's see what else I've got marked off here. Okay.
Hopefully that wasn't offensive that I was laughing through the whole thing, but I just found it hilarious.
I don't think it was offensive. I think that's the way it was written to be kind of
Okay.
funny that way. All right, we have a female author up here. I wanted to make sure we got a woman in here too. This is Amelia B. Edwards. It is The Phantom Coach, which was written a long time ago, back in 1864. So isn't that when they said they started? Oh no, that was 1764. Started doing the stories, right?
Yes,
Yeah, 1764. So this is 100 years after they started telling ghost stories at Christmas Eve. The circumstances I'm about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is vivid, as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I've told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I'd been out all day with my gun, and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December. The place a bleak wide moor in the far north of England, and I'd lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand and stared anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the tiniest cultivated patch or fence or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again and pushed wearily forward, for I'd been on foot since an hour after daybreak and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlor, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We'd been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, we're now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love and, of course, very happy. This morning, when we parted, she'd implored me to return before dusk, and I'd promised her that I would. What would I have not given to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time through wait, would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I too must sleep the sleep of death? Death. I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart. But that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only fancy that I heard a far off cry? I hallooed again, and again. The echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. Thank God, was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. There's a picture of him in this, too. Hey, Kathy, will you hold this for a minute? And Anthony's here. We've got Collins, Jenny. All right. What for? Growled he sulkily. Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow. Then, folks do get cast away hereabouts from time to time. What's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded? If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, my friend, we must submit, I replied. But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I now from Dwaddling? A good 20 mile, more or less. And the nearest village? The nearest village, and that's 12 miles t'other side. Where do you live, then? Out yonder, said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. You're going home, I presume? Maybe I am. Can you? It's like, dude, I'm lost. Help me.
It's freezing cold.
Then I'm then I'm going with you. The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. You can just see this old codger with his lantern going, I live over there. Maybe you can come with me. It ain't no use, growled he. He won't let you in, not he. We'll see about that, I replied briskly. Who is he? The master. Who is the master? That's nowt to you, was the unceremonious reply. Well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and a supper tonight. You can try, muttered my reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled, gnome-like, away from the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. Is this the house? I asked. Aye, it's the house down bay. And he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance. You just see, he's like, I'm not going to let him lock me out.
No, he's like sticking to him like glue.
Hey, Ashley, there's somebody else from Arkansas. I think we have 3 people in here from Arkansas right now.
I can't hardly see. I'm
I
not
know.
used to these reading glasses.
I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute, he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked around with curiosity and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served apparently a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge ob Yeah, in the center of the floor stood some huge object gauntily dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw to my surprise a telescope of very considerable size mounted on a rude movable platform with four small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide with a malicious grin. "Yonder's his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" said he. "How came you here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law, 1 foot across the moor, meat, drink, and sleep." He,
He's very presumptuous, but very to
no
the
kidding.
point.
"I came into your house. I want you to feed me and put me up." "Hey, Tim." And Pam's out of Wisconsin, originally from Illinois. He bent his bushy brows into a portentous frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dare you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the muir and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I was drowning. The right of self preservation." "Self preservation? There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak."
This would be you.
It would be. An inch
Oh
of
my
snow,
God, an
I'm
inch
going
of
to die. He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay if you choose till morning. Jacob serves the supper." With this, he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies from which he'd been disturbed. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangements than the hall, this room contained nevertheless much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios, on the other a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half open door of a cupboard at the other end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals. While on the mantel shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. This guy's got to be a scientist.
Clearly.
Every chair had its burden, every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon its chance to rest. So strange a room I'd never seen, yet seemed it stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair, it had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Ludwig van Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. So I guess he's decided he's going to let him stay. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir, said my entertainer. Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder. I'd already fallen upon the viands and now protested with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly, sat down to his own supper, which consisted primitively of as primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. Let me take a quick swig here. Hey, Misty. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, said, Sir, I've lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I've not seen as many strange faces, and I've not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long? Pray, interrogate me, I replied. I am heartily at your service. He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to the practical purposes of life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied as well as my slight information permitted. But the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked and I listened, spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence and only thought aloud. I'd never heard anything like it then. I've never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and still leaning forward in the same moody attitude with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer, from practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reinbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes. Is that how you say his name? Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and Magi and mystics of the East were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips, as sequences in music. By and by I forgot now by what link of conjecture and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, specters, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. Well, sounds like a question to me. Hey, Leanna. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet, what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firm by tests wide and so various, attested by all races of men, in all ages and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savage of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist? This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. You know, I never even thought of that, Kelly. The point he's making here, is there any other phenomenon out there that it doesn't matter what culture, what time period, people, beliefs have not had some kind, doesn't matter what culture, what time period, people, beliefs have not had some kind of,
Unexplained.
yes, ghost stories.
Yeah.
I mean, everywhere. That's so cool. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned as a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands and added with an altered voice and manner, I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me as I've forgotten the world. You have my history. It's a very sad one, I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer. It's a very common one, he replied. I've only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me. He rose as if desirous of ending the conversation and went over to the window. It has ceased snowing, he observed, and he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. Ceased, I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. Oh, if it were only possible, but no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight. Walk 20 miles my way, and who is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror. Where is she? At Dwaddling, 20 miles away. At Dwaddling, he echoed thoughtfully. Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles, but are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours? So very, very anxious that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse. Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate, said he, smiling. The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dwaddling, passes within 5 miles of this spot. Good night,
Good
Morgan.
night, Morgan. Sweet dreams. Merry Christmas.
Sugar plums, dream of sugar plums.
Don't dream of Krampus.
No. He smiled.
I don't know. Sounds good.
I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and so I drank it. It was so strong that it went down my throat like liquid flame and almost took my breath away. I thanked him for his hospitality and would have shaken hands with him, but that he had turned away almost before I could finish my sentence. In another minute, I had traversed the hall. Jacob had locked the two locks on the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide, white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead. Not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet,
So basically,
inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears, his eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images and fragments of splendid reasoning in the very words in which he'd uttered them. Musing thus over what I'd heard and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on at the heel of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt and said, Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand, and you can't fail of the way. This, then, is the old coach road? Aye, 'tis the old coach road. And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads? Nigh upon 3 mile. I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative.
I'm sure he did.
Kathy says crunching snow is one of her favorite sounds. I actually do like that
I
too.
love it. Yes. It's a
The
little bit icy.
The road's a fair road, a good 50 feet and more, just at the worst bit of road in the whole county. Horrible! Were many lives lost? All. 4 were found dead, and t'other 2 died next morning. How long is it since this happened? Just 9 years. Near the signpost, you say. I'll bear it in mind. Good night. Good matter of the slightest difficulty, for despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale glow, and how solitary. a strange, disagreeable thing that I was forced to stop and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I at first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but then a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first, and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that this must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seems strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast, and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I'd passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost? And could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and four streaming grays, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guard, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself. There were but 3 passengers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself of my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. Uh-oh. Amanda currently is having storm number 2. 20 centimeters of snow down with possibly 30 more by morning.
Holy smokes.
And Pam says she could go without the cold. Yeah, same here. Okay, so he's jumped into a very cold coach that stinks.
Like death, probably.
I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle as if absorbed in his own reflections. How intensely cold it is tonight, I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. The winter, I added, seems to have begun in earnest. Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other time I should have felt and perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at that moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question, somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost my patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation apparently of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly and saw, by the uncertain light of the outer lamps, that it was in the last state of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. Hey, Jenny, how is it down under?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Hey, Jenny. Thanks for joining us.
Let's see. The sashes splintered at a touch. The leather fittings were crusted over with mold and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been moldering away for years to do another day or 2 of duty on the road. I turned to the third passenger, whom I'd not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. This coach, I said, is in deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair? He moved his head slowly and looked me in the face without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in the agony of death and showed the gleaming teeth between. Eee. Hey, Michelle.
I think you climbed into a doom buggy.
Doom buggy for sure. They had 999 ghosts, room for one more. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He too was looking at me with the same startling pallor in his face and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own and saw, oh heaven, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man. The none of them were living man. Like myself, a pale phosphorescent light, the fight of,
Putrefaction.
I think it should be the light of putrefaction. Is that what it is? I would say putrefaction. That works. Played upon their awful faces, upon their hair, dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes, earth stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Oh. Ah!
He didn't have much of a benefactor when he came upon that house, apparently.
No.
He advised him to go that way.
That was my shriek of terror. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud. The ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. Oh boy.
He chose the wrong ride.
That was not a good coach to get in. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you, in half a dozen words, the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I'd fallen over a precipice close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lightning. Wait. Oh, sorry. I had fallen over a precipice close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift, I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull.
Oh my god.
How do you have a compound? How do you have that?
It's part of your skull sticking out of your skin.
Yeah, I mean, how can?
And how did he survive?
Yeah, with that. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and thanks to youth and a fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before.
Shocking.
I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a dream born of brain fever. We discussed the question over and over until we found that we could discuss it no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach. Dun, dun, dun. Well, those were our 3 stories to share with you guys. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with us on this Christmas Eve.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
We greatly appreciate having you guys here. So continue to have a merry, happy, whatever it is that you're observing at this time of the year. particularly Christmas Eve, since that's what we're observing ourselves.
Yes.
We're going to go in, probably leave some cookies, and we don't have any milk.
Yes, we do.
We do?
Yes.
We'll leave some cookies and milk for
I'm
Santa,
always prepared.
who hopefully can make it through our little doggy door. I don't know if he can do it.
Well,
Here,
the-
hold this for a
he'll
minute.
go like this. And I'm not picking my nose. I'm putting my finger aside my nose.
Do you think Santa can fit through that?
You could fit through that. Santa could fit through that. Besides, he just goes like
Wait
that.
a minute. You just said
He-
I could fit through that, so Santa could fit through that.
Well-
Are you trying to say what are you saying about me? That I'm fat? I got it. Oh! Sorry, guys. That I have
oh my goodness.
a belly full of jelly?
No. He just goes like this. I'm not picking my nose. He lays
Okay.
his finger aside his nose and no, that's bewitched. She wiggled her. Never mind.
Whatever. All right, guys.
I'm very tired. I
Have a
didn't sleep
great
last
night. Thanks for joining us and be watching Thursday. We will have the next episode up. And since you're here, we'll let you know that it's about a Victorian haunted house in Iowa.
Come join us. Good night, you guys. Merry Christmas Eve.
Keep it spooky. And goodbye to you guys over on YouTube too.
I guess because, like, do you have a hard time transitioning
From
from
what?
like wearing them to not wearing them? Like
Glasses?
looking at this, I can barely read that.
The only time I have that problem is when I look at my phone
Or am I
without
just
my
tired?
glasses.
Maybe it's so hard to like. I was trying to look over the top.